Hello. Welcome to episode 33 of the Golden Question podcast. Now, I'm going to try to keep things quick. I haven't made a podcast in a while, and that is because I've been busy in schoolwork, and I still am. So let's try to wrap this up real quick. Minimum wage, that's what we're going to be talking about. I just saw a little bit that Ben Shapiro did when he interviewed Ro Khanna. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. He's a representative of California. And supposedly the controversy happened. He sort of came out and said, these large corporations should be able to afford this minimum wage hike. And the whole buzz is, that's the whole point, right? These corporations, they're the ones who can afford to raise the wages, the minimum wages of their employees, and small businesses and pretty much everyone else besides these large corporations can't cover the costs. And I think Ben Shapiro did a great job at trying to debunk that supposed myth, and he tried to argue that the whole point of why corporations want these minimum wages is to stifle out competition, right? It's to give themselves a competitive advantage because they have the sufficient funds, they have the costs spread out amongst many different stores, and obviously their increased revenues. The minimum wage is nothing for them, right? They might as well go above 15. They could probably even afford doing $20-$25 minimum wage, and it won't affect them. But of course, for everybody else, it's pretty much a death sentence to the business, right? It's over. It's going to go bankrupt. Their margins are already very slim, and raising this minimum wage is just adding more fuel to the fire. But I feel like something that Ben Shapiro didn't mention is Ro Khanna brought up the point where, again, I forget the term. I think they're called monopolies. It's supposedly, he said it's a term that Milton Friedman came up with. I haven't read all of Milton Friedman's books. I did read, I think it's called Capitalism and Freedom. And I didn't read all of it. I sort of, you know, read a couple chapters here and there, but I do plan on reading in its entirety. And I sort of got disinterested when he started talking down upon the gold standard, and I was like, I don't know if I agree with that, which is okay because you're not supposed to agree with everything everybody says, right? I don't. For me, the person who I agree with the most would be Peter Schiff, but even Peter Schiff, I don't agree with him 100%, which I think is the beauty of having your own independent mind, is that you can formulate your own opinions in a structure that is unique, where you can take bits and pieces from everybody and come up with your own new worldview in a way that is unique and different from everybody else. But supposedly, Ro Khanna said that Milton Friedman came up with this term, monopolies. Again, if I'm mistaking the term, essentially, it's a city in which there aren't enough employers, and I guess there's only a couple of employers, and they sort of are can get away with suppressing the wages of their employees. Now, I haven't looked at the arguments that Milton Friedman has posed and the certain conditions for this scenario to arise. But from the looks of it, from the looks of it, Ro Khanna was saying we have some cities that have corporations. There's not enough businesses in these cities, and so they can get away with underpaying their employees. And the only way to remedy this is to artificially increase the minimum wage with government intervention. Now, for me, again, there's a slew of different arguments against the minimum wage. I'm not going to get into all of them. I mean, there's definitely a lot of, if I were to explain it, I wouldn't do the arguments justice. There's many different more elaborate ways of people explaining the several arguments against the minimum wage. But what I want to do here is I want to sort of explain a little bit about, I touched up on it on a previous podcast before, and that is how government never fixes a problem from its source, right? It always adds a band-aid to a problem that it already created. And sometimes that temporary solution that it gave ends up hurting even worse than the original problem, especially in the long term. And what was really funny was in that small interview with Ben Shapiro and Representative Ro Khanna, he said businesses are not long term, and government is, and so that's where government needs to step in and make the long term decisions, which I thought was hilarious. I couldn't believe he said it with a straight face. I didn't. I'm surprised Ben Shapiro didn't, come out with the little giggle, but I certainly laughed at it because it's the complete opposite, right? You have businesses who are people running these businesses. There are people who want to care about their long-term success, the long-term success. Again, everybody in the company, right? It's the employees who care about the long-term success. It's the owners, right? And so it can't be farther from the truth, right? It's government that only cares about the short term, especially in this case, unfortunately, the Federal Reserve, right? That cares about the short term, um, at the expense of the long term. So again, I think I've already elaborated on that, with interest rates, the Federal Reserve, and how everything they're doing is sacrificing the long term for the short term benefit. But something about the issue with solving a problem by just masking over it and not solving it directly is by definition caring about the short term and not caring about the long term. Right? So supposedly if we do have these monopolies, again, if I'm mistaking the term, it's going to sound really stupid, but if we have these cities where there are monopolies, in which an industry, or it's probably not an industry because there could be several businesses in that industry, but even if there is a business that isn't really having any competing forces to drive up the wages, the question becomes now, instead of just trying the government to come in and slap a minimum wage that the company has to pay, why not ask the question? Why are there not any businesses competing in that supposed city? Why are there so few businesses? Why are there these large corporations, um, and not enough small, mom and pop shops? Why? That's the problem. That's the underlying problem here, is that you have not enough competition, not enough businesses in that city to compete for the employees and to drive up the wages as a result. That's the underlying question. And so I feel like what Ben Shapiro should have responded by when Ro Khanna made that point is, well, let's take that as a given, right? We have some cities that have some monopolistic behaviors, in terms of their businesses, right? There are some businesses that have monopolies. The question is, instead of for government coming in, setting a minimum wage that now these businesses have to abide by, but the businesses are still there and there's still a monopoly. It's not like once you raise the minimum wage, the monopoly goes away. In fact, they get even more entrenched. Instead of doing, going for the government route by applying a minimum wage, why not try to find a way to allow more businesses to compete, to drive up wages sort of indirectly? And maybe only then will you find out why those businesses became monopolies to begin with. Now, Ben Shapiro did touch upon this. He said the minimum wage, in effect, causes monopolies because it makes them more entrenched um, in their industry, in their sector, because again, they could drive out competition. And so they get even more, they can grow even larger. And it makes it even harder for new business to emerge, who have to now abide by some of the regulations that these already established businesses have to abide by. But I think this is a perfect example, right? Minimum wage is one of the many examples in which government puts a band-aid on a problem that it has caused, right? So you have government right now that passes all these rules and regulations, right? All these different policies, um, just laws, regulations by agencies that they have to abide by. And of course, the large corporations who already have large revenue streams can, of course, adapt and comply with these rules and regulations. But a lot of these small businesses, and especially new and emerging businesses that want to compete with these large corporations, they can't deal with those rules and regulations. I mean, by definition, right? If you're going to pass a rule and regulation, obviously the big boys are going to be able to deal with it, but the the less the smaller businesses that have fewer revenues are obviously not going to be able to afford to comply with those regulations. I mean, it's just common sense, right? I'm trying to think of an example here, right? If you have a bodybuilder and you have your average kid and you give them a weight, one might be able to lift it easy, but the other one might struggle, right? It's still the same weight for both, right? It's not like the whatever rule and regulation you're applying is being um it needs to be affected more by the large businesses and in proportion with the smaller ones, right? Then you're segregating right there, which is I think you can somehow somebody can argue that it's against the law, right? You can't pass a law that's directed at certain people. The law has to be applied evenly, which then again proves the point that you can't have these regulations, because these regulations, again, the larger businesses are going to be able to comply, smaller ones can't. So a natural instinct would be to make more strict regulations for larger corporations and less strict regulations for smaller businesses. But then that right there throws into question: are you applying the law evenly across all people, all citizens? And of course, I think one could argue that that's not the case. So the only solution is, if you have a city where there are monopolies, ask yourself this: what caused those monopolies to emerge? And what you'll soon come out to find is it's the government regulations, it's the government policy that has caused these corporations to become monopolies, or these businesses, right? It doesn't have to be a corporation. It could just be, a small business that gained a strong foothold unfairly, right? It's not producing better goods and services than everybody else. It's simply because it happened to emerge at the right time where there weren't any regulations, and it happened to stay up until the point where the regulations were made. Any point after that, if you're a business that wants to form after the regulations have been made, or you're a business who was just starting up, maybe started a couple of years before the laws have been passed, you're at a significant disadvantage, because the player, the one who's already established, already has the means at which to comply. So what's ironic here is, again, it's the government that makes the short-term beneficiary decisions, right? It doesn't care about the long term, because if it did care about the long term, it would try to solve the problem from its root cause to prevent it from ever arising in the future. That's the whole definition of caring about the long term: is let's solve the problem now and let's get it done for all. Let's not want to deal with it in the future. If you solve a problem in the short term, you might not have to deal with it in the next couple of years, but the problem may soon arise after the certain duration. So, and this is why the minimum wage has to keep rising, right? It obviously has to adjust for inflation, but factor out inflation, you're going to have to keep raising the minimum wage, because you apply the minimum wage. And again, this is another argument that Ben Shapiro should have applied, is that if you really care about the long term, why does the minimum wage need to keep adjusting every 5 or 10 years? If you truly care about the long term, why not make a law that can be long term? That's the very definition of having, if you want to say that this law is long term, you shouldn't have to change it. Then it's not long term. It's a short term law that needs to keep adjusting. So the reason why the minimum wage needs to keep changing, regardless of inflation, right? Inflation is a big factor in why the minimum wage needs to keep increasing. But apart from that, you have a minimum wage that gets passed. Some employees get fired. Some employees do get that increased benefit. Businesses now become less productive, right? There's fewer employees now. They probably have to work them harder. to justify the increased wage, right? You're not going to just get paid for simply doing nothing. And again, what's the precedent that sets? What's the lesson that teaches workers, right? It's, you know, usually in order to get an increased wage, you need to prove to your employer that you're doing a better job and that you're doing, let's say you're doing better than someone else and therefore you deserve a better wage than him, right? If you can just increase your wages by not increasing your productivity, what lesson does that teach? There's no point in working harder to increase your wages. You could just have the government do it for you without ever having to sweat an extra or to put an extra sweat. So by definition, when you pass the minimum wage, businesses become less productive, and then the revenues decrease. They can't cover some of the expenses. Some businesses go bankrupt, and so you have fewer businesses, fewer people employed, and then some people, right? They can run off and get some lower wage job that they now lost, or it can get some alternative job that they now lost. But obviously, it's not going to be uh, as desirable as the one that they had. And then a new minimum wage is going to get passed because those people now can't supposedly can't survive on those wages again. And then after time, the minimum wage gets raised, and the cycle just feeds in and on itself. And this is regardless of inflation. But again, I don't want to diminish the importance of of inflation in the issue of the minimum wage, but I certainly think it is. And I think this should be an issue brought up, with the Fed, right? If somebody should ask Jerome, surely the minimum wage is going up, the minimum wage is going up. Surely it isn't. Surely it should be a cause of concern for people who are arguing for inflation, right? If one could point towards the fact that the minimum people are crying out that the minimum wage needs to be increased, could that be an effect of the inflationary forces that are emerging from the Fed? So that could be an argument made there. But besides the monetary debate, one could just focus, I think, strictly. I think you could say philosophically, and that is government cares about the short term, and so it just wants to keep keep applying the minimum wage, and it may fix the problem for a couple years now, but once wages start to increase, people are going to ask for more. Once you factor in inflation, they're going to need to keep raising the minimum wage, and that's the very definition of doing something long term, and that is, doing something short term, and that is having to continuously come in and adjust it. It's not a long term solution, right? If I apply a Band-Aid to this large scab, the Band-Aid might only work for a day or two, and then I'm going to need to apply another one, and then take off the old one and apply another one, right? Instead of solving the problem from its root cause so that you don't ever have to deal with it, right? The minimum wage problem emerges every 10 years, right? If you care about the long term, there should be a long term solution. And it shouldn't be a solution where the problem arises 10 years later. The minimum wage problem has always arisen ever since it's been passed, right? It's like a drug, it's like an addiction, right? Any government program, once it gets passed, it just continuously grows. It can never get past, solve the supposed problem that it fixed, and then go away because we don't need it anymore and we fix the problem. That's not how government works. Government, first of all, it indirectly causes a problem, or directly, but we could say it causes a problem, and then it comes with this program to fix it. But the program actually just makes the problem worse, which then justifies a larger program that needs to get passed, which then makes the problem even that much worse. And then it's just a cycle that feeds in on itself, right? The government causes the problem. It passes a program to supposedly fix the problem. That program actually makes the problem worse. And that, if somebody asks me, what's the definition of government? I'll give them that definition. A program that attempts to fix a problem, but actually makes it worse, which then justifies its own existence. and increase, right? It's not only that the program needs to stay, we need to add more money to the program. And this is why government expenses just go completely out of the charts, because it the program always needs to get increased to supposedly fix the additional problems that it caused. Um, and the minimum wage is just one example out of many. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you did, please consider visiting my YouTube channel and subscribing. And I hope you guys stay safe.